Well, as promised, let's take you here now. The emergency special session of the UN General Assembly on Ukraine is sitting today after 22 member states, including France, the UK and the US, wrote to the president of the 193-member UN body, President Abdullah Shahid, to convene the meeting. Let's go there live now.
Please use the stairway next to the elevator banks. Members will recall that in paragraph 16 of its resolution ES-11/1, the Assembly decided, quote, to adjourn the 11th emergency special session of the General Assembly temporarily and to authorize the President of the General Assembly to resume its meetings upon request from member states. In this regard, I should like to draw the attention of delegations to document A/ES-11/4, which contains a joint letter dated 21 March 2022 from the permanent representatives of Antigua and Barbuda, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Estonia, France, Georgia, Germany, Guatemala, Italy, Japan, Latvia, Lithuania, Mexico, Panama, Poland, Republic of Korea, Turkey, Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America, to the United Nations address to the President of the General Assembly requesting the resumption of the 11th emergency special session of the General Assembly. I intend to conduct the proceedings of this meeting in accordance with the rules of procedure of the General Assembly and the past practices of its emergency special sessions. The Assembly will now resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5, entitled, quote, letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council in document S/2014/136. In this connection, the Assembly has before it two draft resolutions in documents A/ES-11/L.2 and A/ES-11/L.3. Rule 91 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly reads as follows, quote, if two or more proposals relate to the same question, the General Assembly shall, unless it decides otherwise, vote on the proposals in the order which they have been submitted. The General Assembly may, after each vote on a proposal, decide whether to vote on the next proposal. End quote. Therefore, the Assembly will consider the draft proposals in the order in which they have been submitted. This means that the draft proposal that was submitted first, contained in document A/ES-11/L.2, will be considered first. Excellencies, I wish to make the following statement on behalf of the President of the General Assembly. The security situation in Ukraine has deteriorated rapidly following the launch of the Russian military offensive on 24 February 2022. Armed violence has escalated in various regions of Ukraine, including the capital city of Kyiv. The intense military escalation and rapid expansion of the conflict throughout the country has resulted in severe loss of life, injuries, misery, and mass movement and displacement of the civilian population throughout the country and to neighboring countries, as well as severe destruction and damage to civilian infrastructure and residential housing. According to UN data, around 3.56 million people have fled Ukraine and 6.5 million have been displaced within the country since February 24. In other words, around 1 in 4 of Ukraine's 44 million population has either fled the country or has been internally displaced since the war began. Essential services such as water, electricity, heating, and emergency health and social services are under severe strain, and people's access to health care continues to be limited by growing insecurity and shrinking humanitarian space. This is projected to deepen and expand humanitarian needs among millions of Ukrainians and other community members. People on the move are extremely vulnerable to numerous potential health and protection risks, while local capacities in host communities receiving growing numbers of displaced people are already stretched to the brink. Allowing for safe and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance for those in need in Ukraine, including women, children, the elderly, the disabled, and humanitarian personnel, is the need of the hour. I would again reiterate my call to all parties to respect international law and international humanitarian law." End quote. I now wish to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce Resolution A/ES-11/L.2.
Mr. Chair, distinguished delegates, a month ago, on the 23rd of February, the General Assembly held the debate on the situation in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. It was just a few hours before the Russian unprovoked and unjustified war against my country started. As Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said from this rostrum at that meeting, and I quote, "We need swift, concrete, and resolute actions. A new type of action by the UN and the international community which is relevant to the level of threat we all, not just Ukraine, face today because of Russia's aggressive course. We are at critical juncture in world history, and our actions today will define it for decades to come." End of quote. And tomorrow will be another symbolic date, a month since the lives of millions of Ukrainians were split in two parts. A peaceful past full of joy and positive plans, and the present with war, suffering, death, and destruction. Thousands of Ukrainians have lost their lives over this month, young and old, women and men, civilians and military. They died because Russia decided to attack Ukraine, attack peace, attack all of us. Every day of the Russian war against Ukraine aggravates humanitarian situation further and further. In a nutshell, it has already reached the level of humanitarian disaster. People are starving to death in the occupied or besieged areas. People are being killed in their attempt to flee from conflict-affected areas. Cities are razed to the ground by shelling and airstrikes. Neighboring countries are stretched to their limits of accommodating millions of Ukrainian refugees. These developments have prompted a cross-regional group of 24 states that represent all regions to work together on a draft resolution entitled "Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression Against Ukraine." I would like to repeat, 24 states from all regions. The text under A/ES-11/L2 is a result of a collective and informed effort. And here I would like to express special thanks to France and Mexico for their dedicated leadership during these long days of consultations. While clearly pointing to the root cause of the humanitarian catastrophe, it is an action-oriented text that places the main focus on the urgent needs to alleviate the humanitarian suffering on the ground. Immediate cessation of hostilities by the Russian Federation, in particular any attacks against civilians and civilian objects. Protection of civilians, including humanitarian and medical personnel, journalists, persons in vulnerable situations, foreign nationals, notably students. Ensuring safe and unhindered passage for all civilians fleeing armed conflict and violence, putting an end to the practice of sieges of cities of Ukraine, in particular the city of Mariupol, respect for international humanitarian law, human rights law, and refugee law. The intention of the initiators and co-sponsors of the draft resolution is to ensure the words are translated into prompt actions on the ground. It will be critical to prevent a spillover effect for the entire world. That is why the text also mentions the impact of the conflict on food security globally, in particular in the least developed countries, as well as energy security. We ask all those who stand against the war to vote with us, to vote for the draft entitled Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression Against Ukraine. It will send a powerful message aimed at contributing to a breakthrough in humanitarian action on the ground and making the aggressor stop its unprovoked war. We are encouraged by the growing number of countries who resolutely support as co-sponsors this truly cross-regional draft that gives the Assembly a chance to speak with a powerful voice, so needed to give peace a chance. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me ask you how many times in this hall you have felt a sense of apathy in the air. At best, that your action is not essential, that staying on the so-called safe side is the best option, that there are others who will act and deal with the matter. Basically, it is diffusion of responsibility. When the more onlookers there are, the less personal responsibility individuals will feel to take action. It is, ladies and gentlemen, the bystander effect, or bystander apathy, which is a social psychological theory that states that individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim when there are other people present, like on a busy street in a megapolis. But let me remind you that the General Assembly should not be ruled by the street violence psychology. After all, we are here united nations. And that is why this morning 8 dozen countries have already co-sponsored the draft. We are not bystander nations that diffuse responsibility. We do not trivialize murder. We do not make a taboo of murder's identity, anonymizing it. We do not fall victims of any Stockholm syndrome, sipping coffee with a serial killer in the delegates' lounge or in a Vienna cafe. Or do we? Think about it when you vote during this emergency session. I call upon all responsible members to support the draft, and I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and greetings to the President of the General Assembly for agreeing to reopen the session and for his message that you passed on this morning. Colleagues, I speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries from North Macedonia, Montenegro and Albania, the country of the stabilization and association process and potential candidate Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the EFTA countries, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, members of the European Union, European Economic Area, as well as Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Georgia and Monaco, San Marino and Andorra, align themselves with the statement. Mr. President, colleagues, as we speak, the inhabitants of Mariupol have been under siege for 24 consecutive days. They are bombed day and night. Almost 90% of the city's residential areas have been razed to the ground. The humanitarian situation is catastrophic. Russia is blocking the delivery of humanitarian assistance and evacuation of the civilian population to other parts of Ukraine. It is heartbreaking to see yet another humanitarian catastrophe unfolding before our eyes, adding to the dire humanitarian situations identified by the UN in Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Ethiopia, Sudan, not to mention other parts of the world. Instead of joining international efforts to heal existing wounds, Russia is opening new ones. Nearly every day, we witness Russian attacks against Ukraine's civilian population and infrastructure. We've heard about attacks on evacuees escaping besieged cities, shelling of innocent people queuing to buy their bread. We have seen shelling of more than 500 schools, at least 52 hospitals, more than 1,500 residential buildings and a theater in Mariupol sheltering civilians, including many children. We have received reports of cluster munitions being used in populated areas. In less than a month, 10 million people have fled their homes. More than 12 million are in direct need of humanitarian assistance. Deliberate attacks on civilians are shameful, reprehensible, and constitute serious violations of international humanitarian law. The EU continues to advocate full compliance with international humanitarian law and to avoid civilian suffering. On the 2nd of March, this Assembly adopted by an overwhelming majority a resolution deploring in the strongest terms the Russian aggression against Ukraine, condemning all violations of international humanitarian law and demanding the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. Russia has done nothing to implement this resolution. On the contrary, it has intensified its hostilities, causing further devastation and suffering. Mr. President, these are dark days, not only for Ukraine and its people, but for the world in its entirety. We are witnessing the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. More than 3.6 million people have fled Ukraine to neighboring countries. At least another 6.5 million are internally displaced within Ukraine. In addition to the millions of Ukrainian citizens, there are also thousands of people from other parts of the world, students, workers, migrants, who are caught in the conflict. Many have been instrumentalized by Russia and its disinformation campaign. Destruction and displacement is happening on a huge scale. The numbers of displaced people have exceeded in 4 weeks the numbers displaced in 4 years by the terrible conflict in Syria. EU member states have kept their borders open for everyone fleeing the war. We are committed to provide safety and shelter for all people fleeing Ukraine, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, religion or race. Beyond Europe, this conflict is putting millions of people at risk of food insecurity, in particular in the least developed countries, often adding to existing humanitarian hardships. In this regard, we support the Secretary General's initiative to set up a global crisis group to identify concrete measures in addressing these risks. The EU and its member states are also responding to the food insecurity caused by the conflict. The European Commission has today announced new measures to address global food insecurity, not least in the Sahel and the Lake Chad basin. The EU is actively mobilizing the international community to urgently scale up multilateral action, also beyond humanitarian assistance. This includes ensuring that UN bodies with mandates relevant to food security are able to take the necessary actions. Food security is central to FAO's mandate. For example, it has a key role to play in analyzing and addressing the impacts that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is having on international food systems and in preventing further deterioration, with a particular focus on protecting the most vulnerable. We are working to ensure that food security is integrated in the efforts of the whole UN system, including the UN Security Council and this General Assembly. This is in addition to urgent humanitarian assistance that the EU and its member states are providing to the Ukrainian population. We have committed significant funding to the UN Humanitarian Flash Appeal and Regional Refugee Response Plan for Ukraine, and we have activated the European Civil Protection Mechanism. So far, the EU Commission has announced 500 million euros in emergency aid, of which over 93 million in humanitarian aid to Ukraine and Moldova this year. And the EU has been a solid supporter of Ukraine over the last years. Since 2014, the EU and its member states have provided 2.4 billion euros in humanitarian emergency and early recovery assistance to Ukraine. Over the past 8 years, the EU has addressed and supported the needs of vulnerable people, including women, children and the elderly, also in eastern Ukraine, on both sides of the contact line. Our principled humanitarian assistance benefits vulnerable people living on both sides of the front line. And let us make it clear, this will continue. I also want to stress here that in parallel to our assistance to Ukraine, we will continue to provide assistance to people fleeing other conflicts around the world or affected by other crises, as we already do in Yemen, Ethiopia and the Sahel. The Russian aggression against Ukraine will not reduce our attention from other pressing crises. Mr. President, in light of the tragedy that is unfolding, the General Assembly has to take its responsibility and to address this humanitarian catastrophe and urgently call on Russia to respect the basic principles of international humanitarian law that applies to everyone. First, civilians and civilian infrastructure must never be targets. This includes hospitals, schools, water and electricity infrastructure, no matter where they are. Second, sustained, unimpeded humanitarian access must be granted in both directions. Civilians fleeing areas of violence must be able to do so, and humanitarian convoys must be granted access to enter conflict areas. It is urgently needed to establish safe passage, especially from besieged cities such as Mariupol, to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. Humanitarian and medical workers should be able to work safely. We need for the General Assembly to act, as the Ambassador of Ukraine just said. We need a General Assembly resolution which accurately reflects the situation and its causes, which urges the respect of the most basic humanitarian principles that all states have signed up to. We also need the General Assembly to come together in unity and solidarity with the people of Ukraine and in defending the UN Charter and international humanitarian law. The resolution presented by Ukraine and a large cross-regional group of countries addresses not only the most acute situation in Ukraine, but also calls for protection of all those fleeing the war, without discrimination. It also addresses the serious global consequences of Russia's attack on a major agricultural producing country such as Ukraine, with risks for food security in many countries, including developing countries. Mr. President, Russia must stop this war and end this unnecessary suffering. The European Union reiterates the demand of this General Assembly that Russia cease its military action and withdraw all forces from the entire territory of Ukraine immediately and unconditionally, in line with the resolution passed on the 2nd of March in this General Assembly and in line with the order of the International Court of Justice of the 16th of March. We stand in solidarity with the millions of people affected by the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. I thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands, speaking on behalf of the Benelux countries.
Mr. President, I deliver this statement on behalf of the Benelux countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, and my own country, the Netherlands. The Benelux countries align themselves with the statement just made by the European Union. And I thank you, Mr. President, for reconvening this emergency special session and for your statement. Mr. President, at the outset, let me repeat once again that the Benelux countries are unwavering in their support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and its democratic freedom. We condemn in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. As we today discuss the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, let's be clear that Russia alone is responsible for this war and the humanitarian catastrophe it has caused. And it should stop immediately. As ordered by the International Court of Justice on the 16th of March with binding effect, and I quote, "The Russian Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on 24th of February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine." There is no doubt about what needs to be done, and needs to be done immediately. Because, Mr. President, the Russian war against Ukraine has resulted in untold suffering for the Ukrainian people. That's where our focus is today, to put an end to that. The UN has verified that civilians are being attacked. We see images of women and children fleeing their homes, of thousands of people sheltering in metro stations. WHO has reported 43 attacks on hospitals, and even a maternity ward wasn't safe. As we speak, in Mariupol, 100,000 people remain trapped. They fear for their lives every day, every hour, every minute. They are stopped from moving to safer places and are denied access to the assistance that they so badly need. Humanitarian corridors are being negotiated, but agreements are violated time and time again. 12 million people in Ukraine are directly affected by the war. Some are not able to leave. Millions are deprived of food, electricity, water and healthcare. People are traumatized and need mental health care and psychosocial support. Millions more have fled the violence. 600,000 people over the past 4 days alone. And people continue to do so every single day, causing the largest refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. We commend the neighboring countries of Ukraine, including Poland, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia and Moldova, for welcoming the millions of refugees and for stretching their reception capacity to its limit. Mr. President, my second point is to remind ourselves that another consequence of the Russian war in the world's bread basket, with specific attacks on agricultural assets, is rising food insecurity. Not only in Ukraine, but in other parts of the world as well. People in already extremely vulnerable situations in Yemen and the Horn of Africa are fearing they might not be able to feed their families anymore. And there is a real danger of growing food and energy prices causing more economic and social instability around the globe, putting more people at risk. Importantly, the Security Council in 2018 adopted Resolution 2417, exactly to highlight the link between armed conflict and conflict-induced food insecurity. Amongst others, it calls on all parties to refrain from attacking objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian people. This resolution was adopted unanimously and is now more relevant than ever. Mr. President, my third point is on international humanitarian law. We now witness grave violations of international humanitarian law, such as obstruction of aid and attacks on civilian infrastructure on a daily basis. And so we are faced with another crisis, one of disrespect for the important gains in international law we have fought so hard for since the end of the First World War. From the Geneva Conventions and the first additional protocol thereto to the Charter of the UN, all of these norms are being disregarded and trampled upon. We cannot afford to continue going down this road and see principles of humanitarian law rapidly becoming meaningless for the people they are supposed to protect and worthless for all of us that signed on to them. That is why the aggressor should be named and held accountable. Let's be clear. The perpetrators of these crimes should realize that they are being watched and that evidence is being compiled with a view to their prosecution for the crimes they are committed. Mr. President, the Benelux countries stand ready to support the victims of the war in Ukraine. So we call upon all member states to support the cross-regional resolution entitled Humanitarian Consequences of the Aggression against Ukraine that has just been presented. We also urge all donors to immediately pledge unmarked, flexible and additional funds, because we cannot look away from other crises that require our assistance, crises that are already at risk of being exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. Mr. President, there is a solution to stop this humanitarian crisis. There is only one party that chose to start this war. The same party can also decide to stop it. Now. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Netherlands. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lithuania, speaking on behalf of the Nordic-Baltic countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 8 Nordic-Baltic countries: Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Lithuania. All of our countries aligned with the EU statement. On the 2nd of March, 141 countries voted for the resolution entitled Aggression against Ukraine. We deplored in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of Article 2, Para 4 of the Charter, and demanded that the Russian Federation immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine and to refrain from any further unlawful threat or use of force against any member state. We also demanded that the Russian Federation immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw all of its military forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Instead, Russia has continued the war against Ukraine, causing extensive human suffering and many civilian casualties, including those of children. The devastating humanitarian consequences and rapidly deteriorating situation are obvious. When millions of people globally stand on the brink of famine, we are deeply worried about the impact of the invasion and the risk of increased food insecurity. This is an unprovoked act of aggression, and Russia, together with its accomplice Belarus, are responsible for the tremendous suffering inflicted upon the Ukrainian people. Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine grossly violates international law and the principles of the UN Charter and undermines European and global peace and security. All parties in the armed conflict must comply with international law, including international humanitarian law, and ensure protection of civilians in this respect. Russia's disregard for international humanitarian law and attacks against civil populations and civilian infrastructure are appalling. Civilians must not be targeted. Russian forces' attacks on health care and schools are serious violation of international humanitarian law and must cease immediately. Since the General Assembly passed its resolution, the list of alleged war crimes and reported atrocities have mounted. Russia has bombed civilian infrastructure and objects, including hospitals, medical facilities, schools, residential buildings, and churches. Russia has continued shelling peacefully densely populated cities. Several, like Volnovakha and Mariupol, have been almost completely destroyed. According to the reliable sources, Russia is not only using cluster munitions, but also thermobaric and phosphorus bombs in populated areas. These are not standalone cases, but an illustration of the systematic manner in which Russia is waging its war on Ukraine. These inhumane and immoral actions embody Russia's disregard for the international law, including international humanitarian law and the principles upon which the UN is based. More than 10 million people, nearly 1/4 of the population of Ukraine, have been forced to flee their homes. 3.6 million people left Ukraine, mostly women and children. We commend those neighboring countries that have kept their borders open to those seeking protection outside Ukraine without discrimination. Current obstructions of humanitarian access and rapidly changing front lines hinder the delivery of desperately needed humanitarian assistance. Russia also has an obligation to allow rapid, safe, and unhindered access for humanitarian actors to reach all those in need of life-saving assistance, including food, water, healthcare, protection, and shelter, wherever they are. Safe, voluntary passage for civilians and humanitarian actors must be guaranteed and respected, including through the opening of humanitarian corridors. Mr. President, last week, the International Court of Justice explicitly ordered Russia to stop its so-called military operation. An investigation has also been opened by the ICC prosecutor. There will be no impunity for violations of international law, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. All perpetrators must be brought to justice. This is necessary to ensure justice for victims, but also to prevent and to deter future violations. Ensuring accountability is an integral part of our obligation to respect and ensure compliance with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we encourage all Member States to vote for the resolution L2 on the humanitarian consequences of the aggression against Ukraine. In doing so, we send a clear message to Russia. We demand respect for international law, including in international humanitarian law. We demand that every effort is taken to protect civilians at all times, wherever they may be. We demand safe, timely, and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance and to ensure the safety and security of humanitarian personnel. We demand safe humanitarian passage for those who decide to leave voluntarily and protection for those who decide to stay. Agreements for safe humanitarian passage must be respected fully. But first and foremost, we demand that Russia ends the war now. Russia, with Belarus as an accomplice, bears the sole responsibility for the war and the humanitarian crisis. I wish to conclude by expressing our admiration and deep solidarity with the people of Ukraine who are fighting not only for their country, but for universal democratic values. Your courage is truly an inspiration for us all. We stand with you. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Lithuania speaking on behalf of the Nordic-Baltic countries. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, уважаемые коллеги, на днях мы узнали о том, что наши западные партнеры попросили возобновить чрезвычайную спецсессию по ситуации на Украине. Ни для кого, я думаю, не секрет, что сделали они это для того, чтобы поставить на голосование свой проект якобы гуманитарной резолюции Генассамблеи. Причина якобы в том, что гуманитарную резолюцию не смог принять Совет Безопасности. Хочу со всей ответственностью сказать вам, что, действуя таким образом, наши западные коллеги лукавят. Совет имеет все возможности для того, чтобы принять столь нужный для гуманитарщиков документ.
A humanitarian resolution would not pass at the Security Council. I would like to, with all responsibility, say to you that in acting such a way, our Western colleagues look disingenuous. The Council has every opportunity to adopt such a necessary document for humanitarian workers. It will be put to the vote at the Security Council and contains absolutely all appropriate elements for this type of resolution. A call for a ceasefire and establishing humanitarian pauses in order to allow for the safe evacuation of civilians without discrimination on any basis, and a call also for attacks not to be waged on critical infrastructure, a call not to place heavy weaponry in densely populated areas and residential areas, and ensuring the protection of humanitarian and medical personnel, due protection for those injured and ill, humane treatment of prisoners, and protection of civilians, particularly women and children. Moreover, it is no secret if I say that all, or even nearly all of these elements we took from a Franco-Mexican draft humanitarian resolution previously submitted to the Security Council. In principle, it suited us also, and we were ready to work on it. That was until our Western colleagues insisted on introducing blatantly anti-Russian elements, without which the draft was not necessary. It does not seem to bother them at the same time, though, that no humanitarian resolution from the Security Council contains a political assessment. It has no place there. Also, this aforementioned Franco-Mexican draft, full of anti-Russian wording, ended up at the General Assembly. Colleagues, this is how we have found ourselves at another political anti-Russian show, set this time in an allegedly humanitarian context. Statements that we have already heard today leave no doubt as to this. If our Western colleagues at the Security Council were really concerned about the humanitarian situation on the ground, then they have an opportunity to show this and vote for our humanitarian draft resolution at the Security Council. Thus, the Security Council would be fulfilling its role. The co-sponsors of the Franco-Mexican draft had a different aim. Add to the GA text voted on March the 2nd with another anti-Russian document. Let me be clear that this scenario will make a resolution to the situation in Ukraine more difficult, because more likely it will embolden Ukrainian negotiators and would nudge them to maintaining the current unrealistic position, which does not relate to the situation on the ground, nor to the need to tackle the root causes, which meant that Russia had to start, almost exactly a month ago, its special military operation in Ukraine. I'd like to recall that we started this operation in order to stop the Kiev regime's 8-year war against civilians in the Donbass, which has already cost the lives of more than 10,000 people, including women and children. The war that our Western colleagues did their best not to notice, or pointed the finger for it at Russia, or even to the people of Donbass themselves. We took this extremely difficult step, having exhausted all peaceful and diplomatic means of resolving the conflict in the Donbass. Only after Kiev unambiguously and on many occasions reaffirmed that it did not intend to fulfill the Minsk agreements as approved by the Security Council resolutions, and only after the Western backers of Kiev, who were behind the Maidan coup in 2014, affirmed that they did not intend to rein in the Ukrainian authorities. Only after the President Zelensky didn't only reaffirm the wish of Ukraine to join NATO, which is a direct threat to the vital interests of our country, but also the threat to have an impact on the nuclear-free status of Ukraine. Only after Ukraine significantly stepped up its shelling of residential areas of LPR and DPR, which is still going on, and when Russia received influxes of refugees. In order for Ukraine to no longer pose a threat to Russia, it needed to carry out its denazification and demilitarization. This was the main purpose of our military operation. the same time, we stated initially that we would not target civilian objects. And having understood this, the Ukrainian nationalists and radicals, who understood that sooner or later they would have to be held accountable for their crimes committed over the last 8 years, they started to use civilians as human shields and started to place heavy weaponry in residential areas and not allow people to leave cities along humanitarian corridors. And it is this which caused the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. And indeed, in order to alleviate the situation, we expressed our readiness to support a humanitarian resolution at the Security Council. And then we submitted one ourselves after the French and Mexican sponsors moved their humanitarian resolution to the General Assembly. We went into such detail on this in order to show you the real substance of the text that is before the General Assembly. It is also harmful because it paints a false, one-dimensional picture of what has happened, and it ignores the reasons of the crisis in Ukraine and does not mention the role of Western countries in stoking it, who saw this country as people only as pawns in a geopolitical game against Russia. And I think that we will come back to this question following the end of our special military operation. With all of this in mind, I'd like to call on all right-minded countries who are not paralysed by bloc discipline to not support the draft submitted by the Western countries. Against the backdrop of anti-Russian efforts of our Western colleagues, we note the initiative of our partners from South Africa, who submitted an alternative text, actually very close to our humanitarian draft resolution at the Security Council. We understand the humanitarian focus of this draft. Colleagues, supporting the draft of the South Africa is not only a signal to the civilians in Ukraine that the UN is aware of the difficult situation they find themselves in and is trying to help them. It is also another opportunity to take a stance on the unprecedented economic and political pressure that the majority of you have been receiving in recent times from Western countries. I'd like to hope that the majority of our colleagues will make the correct and crucially independent choice. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, we step out of that 11th emergency special session of the UN General Assembly. We've just been hearing from that Russian representative who has been just delivering his draft resolution. And now, as you know, South Africa has postponed the introduction of its General Assembly draft resolution on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. South Africa originally was due to speak second on the list of speakers in today's special emergency session to introduce its competing draft that sought to depoliticize efforts to address the dire humanitarian situation in the country. But as we understand it, moments before the event was due to begin, South Africa vanished from the speakers list without explanation. Our colleague Sherwin Bryce-Peace is monitoring events there in terms of the emergency special session, and she will be briefing, just on what developments have transpired after this session, and we'll obviously be unpacking that and other shows here on the SABC News Channel. While for me, Unathi Bagyashe, this is where I have to leave you for today, but news certainly does continue right here on the channel. From me and the SA Today team, Kamnandi.